Hello, decision makers. Welcome back to Superposed. My name is Aiden Lewis, and I hope everyone enjoyed the final of the World Cup and especially the England versus France game. Very exciting soccer being played. I also hope that you enjoyed last week's episode on the scandal-ridden decision for FIFA to choose North America to host this year's World Cup. You can find it anywhere you get your podcasts and on YouTube at superposed_decisions. Before we dive into today's episode, I just wanted to share an exciting conversation I had with Dr. Jerome Bussemeyer, who, if you haven't listened to episode 8, our deep dive into quantum cognition, we discussed one of his papers with Dr. Pothos as well, two juggernauts in the field. And I'm very honored to be able to pass on that he wanted me to emphasize the distinction between quantum cognition and another emerging field right now called quantum consciousness. Now, quantum consciousness is essentially the study of how our brain may or may not operate as a quantum computer ourselves, meaning that there are researchers who are studying to see if within our own brain there are quantum computing processes happening. That is separate from quantum cognition, which is what we're interested in, which specifically looks at the cognitive processes and how they are governed by quantum principles as well. And I'll bring this up again in future episodes, but again, quantum consciousness is the hardware, our brain. Quantum cognition, the software, our thoughts and our cognition. And so with that, here's the decision of the day. The year is 1962. You hop out of your behemoth of a car, run a finger along the freshly waxed fins all the way to the front door of your house. You head inside after a long day of working at the anti-communism factory, and turning on the black and white television, you see a familiar face of President John F. Kennedy, looking rather austere and addressing the nation that the U.S. has discovered Soviet nuclear missile sites on Cuba, easily within striking distance of the United States. And you're the closest major target in Miami. What do you do? And more importantly, what do you do as John F. Kennedy? Not only to mitigate the panic in the nation, but to combat the direct existential threats of these nuclear missiles in Cuba. And through this story, we will see just how critical not only the decision itself, but people's perception of the decision can be. We'll discuss later on how to think about the optics of a decision, how to utilize social perception for your own benefit, to enact decisions that serve multiple benefits and inspire confidence in your decision making. Because hey, after all, the world only cares about what it sees, not what's actually happening. The major specific literature today that I have linked down below. There's 3 articles that specifically look at social perception, indecisions, and negotiation. And they are, and sorry for the pronunciation of these names, but Mozich and Krug, Roy et al., and Thomas and Hasty. Check them down below, and thank you for all your good work. And so with that, let's dive into the story. Lasting only 13 days, in October of 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis miraculously only produced one casualty, the U-2 pilot, Major Randolph Anderson, who was shot down during what is known as Black Saturday, and what could have been the start of a nuclear war, costing millions of lives. The Soviets agreed to dismantle their nuclear sites just as fast as they established them. The public reason for this de-escalation was the Soviets dismantling their nuclear sites in exchange for the U.S. not invading Cuba. But in truth, at the time, only 9 people knew the true secret of how the U.S. narrowly avoided the jaws of a nuclear apocalypse. JFK, his brother Robert Kennedy, and the other 7 members of what is now known as ExComm worked round the clock those first 13 days in order to decide how the U.S. would publicly and privately respond. The immediate decision of ExComm was to implement a naval blockade of Cuba itself, eliminating any chance that any more Soviet personnel or equipment could actually make it onto Cuba, essentially containing the environment. 3 days after this blockade, the Soviets sent a rambling, almost conciliatory letter to ExComm, stating that they would dismantle their nuclear sites in exchange for the US not invading Cuba. This letter arrived on Friday, and it set the stage for the climax of this crisis and what is known as Black Saturday. On Black Saturday, two major events happened. The first was ExComm receiving a second letter from the Soviets via Radio Moscow, stating in a hardline demand that the Soviets would only dismantle their nuclear sites in Cuba if the US took down their nuclear sites in Turkey. This public announcement letter was received at the same time that Major Anderson was shot down over Cuba in a bout of constructive interference that brought this conflict to a critical inflection point. The Soviets had killed a US pilot, and they had nuclear missiles 90 miles from US soil. They sent two very different, very disparate demands for the end of this conflict. So what did President Kennedy and ExComm do? And looking through our lens of quantum cognition, we can gain a better understanding of how President Kennedy and ExComm navigated this vital decision. One wrong move, nuclear war started. And again, our four pillars of quantum cognition are superposition, interference, contextuality, and non-communicative effects. And actually today we are going to talk about a non-communicative effect, order effects. If you're interested in more of the mechanics and having a deeper understanding of these four pillars, I recommend checking out episode 8, our deep dive into quantum cognition. So using a quantum cognition framework, here are my thoughts on the most important aspects of this decision. Starting with one, our superposition. And instead of taking the boring decision of what is ExComm going to do in response to the crisis, are we going to blockade Cuba, are we going to go for direct action, let's take a much more nuanced decision in this case. And that's which demands from the Soviet Union is ExComm going to respond to, and how are they going to address it? And so in our superposition are two options. One is the first letter sent on Friday, which was direct to ExComm. It was conciliatory, and it was more favorable for the US. Option two was the public-facing, hardline demanding, more Soviet sympathetic letter received via Radio Moscow on Black Saturday. So those are the two options in our superposition. And repeatedly it was seen through tapes of Kennedy at this time and through Robert Kennedy's memoir that the major interfering factors, or second pillar, was how do we respond with strength to Moscow without backing them into a corner? And to this day, we see this interference pattern with NATO not wanting to back Putin into a corner in regards to Ukraine, because of course Russia still has nukes. We're also seeing this with Iran. How do we respond with strength without enticing more retaliation or closing the Strait of Hormuz? So this is still an interference pattern that we see in geopolitics today. Another interfering factor is that Kennedy had actually criticized President Eisenhower about his response to Soviet influence in Cuba while he was campaigning. So that's in the back of his mind too. His supporters are going to be thinking that as well. So let's go to our third pillar, contextuality. And there is a really interesting parallel that I want to make here between President Kennedy and his decision of what to do with Cuba. Are we going to go for a naval blockade or direct action? And President Truman's decision with Japan. Are we going to go for a blockade of Japan? Or are we going to go for direct action? And if you're interested in that decision, check out episode 6 about Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb. Obviously, in that case, he had chosen direct action, whereas in this case, Kennedy had chosen a naval blockade instead. And so think about the contextual factors just in that. Cuba's smaller, it doesn't have the same military might, but it's closer to the US and it has nuclear weapons. Whereas Japan was larger, it had a larger military force, but it didn't have any nuclear capabilities at the time. And of course, President Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb led into one of the greatest contextual factors for President Kennedy's decision, i.e. the Cold War. Now, we're not going to dive too deep into the Cold War, and if you're a historian or a Cold War buff, I'd love to talk with you, pick your brain a little bit about what you think the most important aspects of this decision are. But just know that the Cold War is a pervading force through the past 10 years and will continue to be for another 20, 27 years. Another really important contextual element that's a direct result of the Cold War is the Bay of Pigs incident that in 1962 had just happened like a year and a half previous. Now, as a brief description, the Bay of Pigs was essentially the US trying to back Cuban militia groups that were sympathetic to the US and against Fidel Castro, trying to overthrow Fidel Castro. This, of course, failed, and so this is fresh in the memory of John F. Kennedy. An incredible decision in itself, but what I find even more incredible is Kennedy's response to the failed Bay of Pigs incident. Instead of throwing it under the rug or throwing up his hands and just continuing to be the same, Kennedy actually wanted to improve his decision making, and he wanted to understand what went wrong in the Bay of Pigs decision. And so he did something really mature that I think we can all learn from. He organized the Taylor Commission, which specifically looked at the decision making around the Bay of Pigs, made a report on how to improve Kennedy's decision making, and so Kennedy is actually using that advice in order to influence his decision around the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so the Bay of Pigs is actually now becoming a contextual element and also an interfering element for Kennedy himself. We're also seeing at this point in 1962 that the midterm elections are about 3 weeks away, give or take. And so that's another pervading contextual element that Kennedy is really conscious of, is that not only does he have to respond to the Soviets, but he also has to respond in a way that the US public is going to positively align to. And our last contextual element here, and this goes for both the US and the Soviet perspectives, is that the US actually had greater nuclear capabilities at this time. We had more warheads, they were around the world, and we knew how to use them. And so it's always an exciting moment in the show when we get to talk about a non-communicative effect. And today we're going to talk about order effects, because the way in which the two letters were presented to ExComm, the conciliatory letter being first, the hardline letter being second, is going to have an inherent effect on Kennedy and ExComm's decision making. Now, put yourself in the shoes of ExComm. On Friday, you get a direct letter that is almost showing weakness, in a sense, on the Soviet side. And it gives you demands that you are very willing to work with in order to remove nuclear missile sites from Cuba. That's presented to you first. The second, on Black Saturday, is hardline, it's public, and it's definitely in the Soviets' favor. And you think maybe that this is just them looking good for their own public. That presentation versus Friday, got the public, hardlines, Moscow focused demands. On Saturday, getting the conciliatory letter that is direct to you and works with your interests more. Those two sets, just depending on how the letters are presented, for every one of us is going to affect us differently. And I want to hear in the comments below what you think. But the literature shows just the presentation of those two letters in this order is going to affect ExComm's decision making here. Just something to be aware of. And so with our 4 pillars of quantum cognition in place, let's see what Kennedy and ExComm actually did. So again, we're going to have 2 options. Do we respond to the first letter, or do we respond to the second letter? And the main interference factor, how do we come with strength but also not back rush into a corner, doesn't really leave a clear option in this case. Because if the US only responds to the first letter, they're ignoring the hardline demands of the Soviets, and then the US looks weak. But if we come with strength and only address the second letter, then that's going to back Russia into a corner, and they got nukes 90 miles off Key West. The contextual elements here also leave a lot of ambiguity in our superposition. There's some elements like Black Saturday and the killing of a US pilot, and also the midterm elections that favor direct action, but the recent Bay of Pigs incident, and also the fact that Had the US chosen direct action, there was no guarantee that they would actually reach the missile sites in time before the Soviets would actually launch them. So those contextual elements are pushing more towards diplomacy. And so even with our context, we're seeing that the two superposed options are very much even. So Kennedy and ExComm did something really smart here. And again, I think we can learn a lot from this. Is that when life tries to present you two options and neither are favorable, make your third option. Because we're seeing that option one, responding to the first letter, and option two, they favor different interfering and contextual elements. So there's parts of these options that are going to align well with what Kennedy and ExComm actually want. But neither option in itself can be satisfactory. And so they're going to combine the two in order to take the parts and make a really beautiful decision that satisfies all conditions. So what did they do? They actually mirrored the Soviets and brokered a deal where publicly they chose to uphold the first letter, that the US isn't going to invade Cuba, and in response, the Soviets are going to de-escalate and take nuclear sites off of Cuba. But privately, the US is going to take their nuclear sites from Turkey in exchange for the Soviets taking their nuclear sites off Cuba. This satisfies the interfering elements because we're coming with strength and responding to the Soviet threat, but we're not backing Moscow into a corner. We're actually giving them a public-facing win that they can go to their citizens with and say, hey, look at all the great things that we did. We got nuclear sites off of Turkey, which then also satisfies the US, looking good for the public. And so the contextual elements are satisfied. And most importantly, this deal de-escalates what could have been the start of a nuclear fallout. So what would you have done in Kennedy's place, in ExComm's place? Because the Cold War lasted another 27 years. Perhaps Kennedy should have come with direct action and quelled any sort of Soviet influence in the Caribbean. Would you have gone public at the time with knowledge that the US actually had nuclear sites in Turkey? What other options were I and ExComm missing in this superposition? And so through this whole story, here's my takeaway for you. Here's what I think is really important to apply to your own decision making. Is that oftentimes people either try to present us with two options or we erroneously put two options on ourselves, neither of which are going to be satisfactory and fulfilling. And so find that hidden third option. Manufacture your own option. You can dive into that superposition, grab the parts that you want, and get a little creative and make that third option for yourself. Never be locked in to an unsatisfactory binary decision. And oftentimes, finding this hidden third option is just managing perceptions. And so what do I mean by this? Let's take President Kennedy. He's having to deal with three things. One, he's having to deal with US perception of his decision making. Two, he's having to deal with Soviet perception of his decision making. And three, he's actually got to get the nukes off Cuba at the end of the day. And just in case you're wondering how pervasive social perception can be in decision making, one of the studies that I've cited down below actually describes that when just asked to look at a picture and describe what you see, make a decision about what you see, that decision can be influenced by other people's perception. So if you take a picture of me, you say, oh, of course, that's Aiden Lewis right there. And someone says very confidently, no, that's Sean White. I wish. Then the research shows that that perception can actually override your own decision making. So social perception can hijack your own decision making if you're not careful about it. But the social perception can work both ways. When we feel that our decisions are aligned and confirmed by other people, then we get more confident in those decisions and it improves our future decision making. So it can actually build us up. But even if there's discord between your decisions and how you perceive that they're aligned to others and how others perceive your decisions, if there's discord in those two things, even if other people are just flat out wrong, then we feel the reverse effects. We actually become less confident in our decisions and we're more prone to reverse our decisions even if they're correct. So right after the Bay of Pigs, and with midterms coming up, Kennedy is really feeling the social perception of his decisions taking effect. And he wants to closely align with public opinion, and he wants to be very validated in his decision making. Just taking a look at the Soviet side, research has actually shown that in negotiations, people oftentimes believe and have the perception that the other party has interests that are antithetical to their own. And so they won't try to make an optimal negotiation. They'll actually settle for suboptimal in this kind of entrenched mindset. This is especially the case in Cold War geopolitics. And quite frankly, it's amazing that Kennedy and ExComm went that extra step and found that optimal decision in order to de-escalate the conflict, instead of going for a suboptimal decision like invading Cuba. And so just leading up to how to find that optimal third option for ourselves, here's the way that I see this Cuban Missile Crisis decision going down. 1, Kennedy has the Friday letter, the conciliatory letter, in the back pocket. He gains more information on Soviet intent, and he has a favorable outcome for the US public. So he's got that in the back pocket. Black Saturday hits, and he learns another bit about Soviet intent. He gains deeper understanding into what the Soviets actually want. They want the nukes out of Turkey. And they don't really want to use nukes in Cuba because now they're giving the US multiple options. Plus, the Soviets know that the US has greater nuclear capabilities than themselves. And so Kennedy is going to take all of this, and he's essentially going to accept both options in the superposition. But he's going to change the optics or the context in which these decisions are presented to different factions. This gives both the US and the Soviets a win at home, and they get to both walk away from a nuclear war. And thus, all three considerations of Kennedy are satisfied. And as a result of this, fun fact, is that Moscow and DC established a better line of communication so that they could avoid further standoffs after this point. And so what does this mean for your decision making? Well, hopefully we can take a lot of information about negotiations and about how even bittered rivals can understand each other and make a good decision happen. But I want to talk a little bit about the extent to which social perception can be beneficial or deleterious to your own decision making. And really it comes down to this. Make decisions with confidence and people will follow. If you know the way, take the first step and don't look back. Because as soon as you show weakness in your decision, social perception is going to try to tear you apart. And just to showcase this, do you know how many times in my life I've had to battle social perception headwinds in my decisions? Why are you starting a company? Why are you going into the military? Why are you building trading algorithms? Why are you doing a podcast? On and on and on. And if you find that social perception is getting in the way of you following a path that you know to be true, here's my advice. Give people a one-liner that they can understand about what you're doing, say it with confidence, and then get to work. Because the same social perception games are working on other people the same way that they're working on you. If they see you making a decisive judgment, they're going to align to you, not the other way around. Be that anchor, be that waypoint, be true to yourself, and others will reinforce it. But if we have learned anything else today, is that if you want something to happen, send it over to Radio Moscow and they'll help you get it taken care of. And on that cheery note, check out the Superposed Substack on this week's discussion about the science behind visualization tactics. And check out the Superposed YouTube and tune in next week on our episode about how the stock market is actually just one big decision-making device. Again, I really appreciate everyone's advice on how to make Superposed even better. If you have anything that is coming up for you, please let me know in the comments. What's working for you, what's not. I'm doing this for you. I want you to make the best decisions possible. And so if there's something that's not quite clicking with you, please let me know. Also, thank you to the amazing researchers that provided today's literature. And remember, as always, the decision is in your hands. Thank you for listening to Superposed. Aiden out.